In the immaculate stillness of the forbidden city, where even the wind dared not speak too loudly, there lived men who had given everything, quite literally, for proximity to power. They were the silent shadows gliding between silk curtains and golden pillars, the invisible machinery that kept the empire's illusions polished and perfect. They were the court eunuchs, servants of the Son of Heaven, guardians of the palace's most sacred secrets, and the only men allowed to wander freely among imperial concubines without the emperor losing sleep. A privilege, they said. Though one might argue that any privilege requiring the removal of one's manhood is not a privilege at all, but a rather exquisite form of punishment disguised as honor. To become a eunuch was to surrender not just flesh, but identity. The procedure was often performed in the silence of a backroom, with tools that knew neither mercy nor precision. A boy would enter screaming and leave as something else, half man, half relic, destined to orbit the emperor's world like a pale moon reflecting someone else's light. They called it purification, as if mutilation could ever be holy. And yet, in a world ruled by appearances, such sacrifices made perfect sense. The empire was not built on blood, but on obedience. And nothing proves loyalty like losing the ability to sin. Every morning, the eunuchs would awaken before the sun, polishing the corridors of heaven. They dressed in the emperor's colors, bowed before portraits they were not allowed to look at directly, and whispered prayers to gods who had long forgotten them. Their lives were a ballet of servitude, every gesture rehearsed to perfection. To smile too much was arrogance. To speak too loudly was insolence. To think, well, that was the gravest offense of all. The palace rewarded silence far more than it rewarded devotion. After all, devotion can waver. But silence is eternal. In that gilded labyrinth, the emperor's shadow was longer than any man's ambition. He was both god and prisoner, surrounded by an army of mutilated men who existed solely to serve his whims. They managed his letters, his meals, his moods. They dressed him, bathed him, and even carried away his bodily waste in porcelain jars. Imagine such intimacy and such humiliation. The emperor could not trust anyone who still possessed desire, so he surrounded himself with those who no longer could. Power, in its purest form, is always sterile. But make no mistake, eunuchs were not mere victims. Some rose from the depths of mutilation to unimaginable influence. They learned that when one is forbidden to wield a sword, one must master the art of whispering instead. Their tongues became sharper than steel, slicing through rivals with elegance and precision. They maneuvered between ministers and concubines, playing politics with the same delicate cruelty that others reserved for love. Behind every imperial decree, there was often the unseen hand of a eunuch, pressing the seal with fingers that trembled not from fear, but from triumph. It was an irony worthy of the gods themselves. Men who had been stripped of manhood now decided the fates of emperors. Yet their power was always borrowed, never owned. They were like actors performing roles too large for their fragile frames, aware that applause could turn into execution at any moment. The court loved them, feared them, and despised them in equal measure. To the scholar officials, they were abominations. To the concubines, confidants. To the emperor, indispensable tools. And to themselves? Perhaps nothing at all. Still, one must admire the artistry of their suffering. They perfected the delicate balance between servitude and manipulation, between invisibility and control. In a place where one wrong word could cost a head, they learned to speak in riddles, to flatter with poison, to bow while plotting. Their lives were theater, magnificent, deceitful, and endlessly rehearsed. The eunuch's smile was not joy but armor, and every gesture of loyalty was merely camouflage for survival. At night, when the palace lanterns dimmed and the laughter of the concubines faded into the corridors, the eunuchs remained awake, tending to the emperor's dreams. Some wept in silence, touching the scars where their bodies had been altered. Others stared at the moon, envying its fullness. It was said that the spirits of eunuchs never rested after death, condemned to wander through the imperial halls, forever seeking the parts of themselves that were taken. Perhaps that is why the palace always felt cold, no matter how many fires burned within it. There is a strange beauty in their tragedy. They became symbols of loyalty so pure it bordered on madness, devotion so absolute it destroyed the self. The empire celebrated them as examples of virtue, men who had conquered desire. But desire is not a sin, it is proof of life. By erasing it, the eunuchs became hollow reflections of imperial virtue, empty vessels through which power could echo without resistance. The emperor looked upon them and saw perfection. The rest of the world looked upon them and saw ghosts. Centuries later, poets would romanticize their pain. They wrote of eunuchs as saints of discipline, martyrs of duty, men who served not for pleasure but for meaning. How noble, they said. How tragic. And yet, beneath those verses of admiration lay an unspoken cruelty, that their suffering made others feel clean. The empire needed its eunuchs not only to polish the palace floors, but to polish the conscience of the powerful. Each drop of their blood was a reminder that someone else had paid the price of order. It is said that in the final days of the empire, when corruption rotted the palace from within, it was the eunuchs who held the keys, literally and figuratively. They controlled the flow of letters, the audience lists, the treasury gates. They whispered into the ears of dying emperors, deciding who would rise and who would fall. The scholars accused them of decadence, the soldiers of treachery. But perhaps they were simply mirrors reflecting the empire's own decay. After all, who better to represent a dying dynasty than those who had already died a little themselves? To watch them walk through the palace gardens, dressed in robes finer than any scholar's, faces powdered, eyes unreadable, it was to witness the triumph of irony. These were men who had been mutilated to prevent sin, yet wielded temptations far more dangerous than lust. Their power lay not in desire, but in its absence. To want nothing is to become unstoppable. A eunuch could not be bribed with pleasure or legacy. He sought only survival. And in that cold clarity, he often surpassed those who once pitied him. There were, of course, moments of poetry even in their despair. One can imagine an aging eunuch standing by a lotus pond, watching his reflection ripple in the water, half man, half memory, wondering which part was real. The scent of jasmine in the air, the faint echo of a flute from a distant chamber, and the knowledge that tomorrow he would again kneel before a boy emperor and call him Son of Heaven. Such was the theater of obedience, endless, beautiful, and utterly hollow. But what is truly tragic is not what they lost, but what they gained. The eunuch learned that power is the ultimate illusion, something you can hold only by pretending you never wanted it. They smiled while being insulted, bowed while being envied, and endured while others vanished. Their resilience became their curse. They lived longer than most emperors, not because they were blessed, but because fate has a cruel sense of humor. It keeps the witnesses alive. And so, history remembers them with discomfort. Were they villains, victims, or simply products of a system too elegant in its cruelty to admit guilt? Perhaps all three. The eunuch embodies the empire itself, disciplined, polished, hollow. Both the instrument and the result of its obsession with control. Every palace needs someone to bear its sins. In Imperial China, that role fell to those who had already been stripped of everything that made them human. Even now, the word eunuch evokes a strange unease. It carries the scent of incense and blood, silk and tears. We imagine their calm faces, their soft voices, their precise movements, and we shudder, not out of disgust, but recognition. For who among us has not traded a piece of themselves for approval? Who has not silenced a desire to be accepted, mutilated a dream to fit into a system that promised security? The eunuchs may have lived in palaces, but their shadows stretch far beyond the walls of Beijing. In the end, they were men who paid the highest price for the smallest measure of power. They became legends, not for what they did, but for what they endured. The empire that created them has long turned to dust, yet their presence lingers, in paintings, in poems, in the uneasy laughter of those who still serve their own empires of vanity. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all, that in being stripped of manhood, they became eternal symbols of mankind. Because nothing lasts longer than a sacrifice made in vain. And in that sense, the eunuchs of Imperial China achieved a kind of immortality, the cold, silent kind that tastes like gold and grief. Their names are forgotten, their voices erased, Yet their story remains a masterpiece of human contradiction. Loyalty without love, power without passion, life without legacy. And that, dear listener, is why it's a shame to be a court eunuch. Not because they suffered, but because in the end they did it all beautifully.